to start off by saying that I really don't consider myself a big believer in the paranormal. I feel like a lot of the situations can be explained by logical science or something like that. But there are some things that simply just cannot be explained though. Like, there were 3 incidences in my childhood home that I still cannot explain to this day. And if someone has experienced anything similar, then feel free to give me some insight. So, when I was younger, maybe 10 or 11 I would say, we lived in a very large old Victorian house. The house had 5 floors, very long hallways on each floor and old wooden flooring. But there were always creepy sounds at night too, and weird power outages, but that can be attributed to the age of the house for sure. And we liked this house, a lot in fact. But the first incident, it happened in the attic. We called it the attic, but in reality it had a sort of family room, a bathroom, a kitchen, and even a guest room. The 3rd floor stairs have a landing that leads to the attic door, which takes you up a flight of stairs, and you come up to a long hallway on your left that leads you to the family room at the end of the hall. And there's a large window on your right that the moonlight comes through. When you enter the family room, there's a spiral staircase that takes you to the top floor, which is just a dark small room that we never used, except for storage. And one night, I was playing with my toys on the stairs of the 3rd floor, right next to the door that leads to the attic. But we had a cat at that time, and as I was playing, I heard scratching in the attic. But not wanting to get in trouble for her destroying a couch, I am the one who asked for the cat after all. I opened the attic door and walked up the stairs to go and find her. As soon as I reached the top of the stairs and turned down the long hallway, the scratching stopped, and the power to the house went out, and I was now in total darkness. I put my back against the window and sort of slid down and stared down the long hallway, terrified and waiting for the power to come back on. As I slid down, I heard a very loud, slow thump, and then another thump, the sound of someone walking down the spiral staircase. That sound is unmistakable too, because the steps are actually metal. The sound continued. Right behind the family room door, I heard each step. The steps eventually stopped. The family room door moved slightly, and immediately I felt this rush just come over me. I got so cold and my heart started beating in such a way that I felt like I was about to leap out of my chest. After a few seconds, the door bolted open and something started sprinting down the hallway straight at me. I couldn't see a thing, but I felt the movement, that feeling you get when something is near you. And I remember that was the first time I ever felt like true prey. And my heart, it was in my throat, but I screamed as loud as I could. And as soon as it got close to me, the rush went away and the cold, it left my body. My parents ran up the stairs, and after I told them what happened, they went to the breaker box and came up and looked all around and found no one and found nothing. But the handle on the family door room was broken, and the window behind me was actually cracked. Now, it's possible I cracked it when I put my back to it to slide down, but it was cracked at a height that I couldn't actually reach with my body at the time. Anyway, after that, I tried to avoid that part of the house for the most part. The basement, though, it was definitely the worst part of the house. It was one of those dreary, unfurnished concrete floor basement type of things. It was as large as any first floor of a house. I mean, truly massive too. And when you open the door, the short stairs look like you're going into a cellar. And when you come down the stairs, you have to walk forward for like several steps in the dark to find the string of the light and pull it. And even then, that light only illuminates the immediate area, not the rest of the basement. There are several lights like this the further you go, each one with a string to pull. To the left is the rest of the basement. It goes all the way back, and then there's a sort of cove tucked to the left where the dogs sleep. It's out of line of sight. Since there's a small window in the cove, it casts this sort of bluish-black light in the morning and nights from the moon as well. Now, one early morning, around 5 a.m., I had to go and feed the dogs since my dad was out of town. I hated it too when it was my turn because that basement always gave me just a terrible feeling. I would always call the dogs to meet me at the stairs so I didn't have to walk down the stairs in the dark alone. I called for them, waited, and called again, but they didn't come and I heard no sound. So I walked down the stairs in the dark and held my hand out to find the string to pull the light like I always did. As I reached for the light, I saw movement at the end of the basement near the cove and my breath got caught into my chest. I pulled the light fast and the bulb popped with a quick burst of light. In that moment, I saw a man standing at the end of the basement. He didn't disappear like the movies though, and man, did I wish that he had. In the dark, with a sliver of moonlight from the cove window, I could still see him standing there with his back to me. He didn't move at all, and his head was sort of cocked to the left in a really sort of unnatural way, at an angle where his neck had to have been broken almost. He was probably 40 feet away from me, but as I stood there, trying to force a scream through my throat that felt like it was locked up, I couldn't look away, and in those few seconds, I saw that it was less of a man and more of a thing. It had white translucent skin and looked really gangly. I actually wet myself standing up too. I just lost all control. I think the pee snapped me out of it though, because as I felt the warmth on my leg, I started backing away, and as I backed away, it sprinted to the left towards the cove where the dogs were, and I ran upstairs. I actually chipped my tooth falling into the stairs, still chipped to this day as well, and I slammed the door shut and I even locked the latch before I left. I called my mum down and we called the dogs from the top of the stairs, but there was no response. We eventually went down there and both the dogs were huddled together in the corner of the cove, and it took a good 5 minutes to get them to leave the corner and come upstairs with us. In fact, we had to pull them apart and walk them up with us holding their collars. The last one is short and simple, but probably the worst experience that I had in that house. So in that same basement, there's a furnace room to the left of the stairs, about 15 feet away from the stairs. It is dark, cramped, and has all kinds of luggage and extra supplies in it, and all sorts of just stuff. And the day before Thanksgiving, we were preparing for the family to arrive. My mother sent me to get the Thanksgiving table decor, or whatever it's called, and as I walked down the stairs, I saw the furnace room door was cracked open. At that, I sort of stopped dead in my tracks, because that door, it was never left open. We were always told to close it so that the dogs don't get in, and really, my parents made a big deal about it, to be honest. I stayed on the stairs too and just stared at that door. I felt the hair on my neck raise and my fists clenched out of instinct. And as I stared, in the crack of the door, I see a sort of smile and then an eye. The eye was so close to being human, but also not really. It's hard to explain it, but it was as though something had been observing humans to mimic them, but couldn't quite get its face just right. But with that, and the memory of what happened down here last time, I quickly ran up the stairs, and as I did, I heard the creak of the furnace door open further, slammed and locked the door, and that was the last time that I ever went into that basement. From that point on, my parents never made me go back in the basement again, and delegated my basement chores to my siblings. And even though I know that they didn't believe me, it was a truly generous gesture that I am forever thankful for. Funnily enough too, since we moved, I've never experienced anything abnormal in any of our houses. I'm 26 now. I have never had any issues with the paranormal since then. I like to rationalize by telling myself that it was fear and my brain was just playing tricks on me, but I don't know. A part of me just knows that it wasn't. This story takes place in North Italy back in 2014. It was early September, and a friend of mine asked me to make a short hike in the woods near his town, and I agreed since I love hiking. We prepared our backpacks, grabbed some food, and we drove to the place. My friend knew the area pretty well, so we didn't take a map or anything. We also didn't have flashlights because we only planned to return to the car in like a few hours, and in early September, daylight lasts pretty long here, so there was really no need for it. As we went deeper into the woods, we saw beautiful spots, small rivers, a pair of caves that we explored. They were small and had only like one big chamber, but we had lunch and proceeded to sort of follow a trail in a deeply wooded area. After around half an hour, I would say, we were at that point around 50 minutes away from the car since we'd stopped so many times to snap photos or explore areas. We arrived at a pretty large clearing. Now, in that clearing, there were a bunch of around maybe 4 or 5 people, normally dressed. They were just talking and laughing and stuff. There was really nothing suspicious about them either. Just super ordinary people like me and my friend talking to each other. They obviously saw us too, since the clearing had no trees or rocks to cover the view, and we couldn't avoid that, since the trail, after a deep curve, immediately ends into the clearing, proceeding to the other side of it. So we said, once approaching them, since they were in the middle of the track, "Hey there, what's up?" But they didn't answer back and just sort of started to stare at us without saying a single word. This obviously launched a huge red flag in my mind. We stopped too, and I looked at my friend. He looked back at me, concerned. We said again, "Hey," but there was no answer. I started to feel uneasy, so we decided to return back to the car at this point. But soon after we headed back, we realized that they started to follow us. As we noticed it, we yelled, "Why are you following us? Did we do something wrong?" Yeah, we were young and pretty stupid. In these kinds of situations, it's often run immediately and get out of there if people act like this. But again, there was no answer. Obviously, we proceeded to walk faster and tried to get off the trail. It was a pretty dumb choice, but again, my friend did know the area pretty well. But they were always around at maybe a 15-meter distance. We started to panic at this, so we looked again at each other and agreed to get out of there quickly. And as soon as we began to run, we heard them start to run too. This obviously really freaked us out, and we did our best to put some distance between us and them. Another thing that made me panic though was the fact that we were, as said, around 40 minutes away from the car at that point, in a very isolated area, so I thought that we pretty much had no hope. At some point or another too, when we were about maybe halfway back, we noticed that they weren't behind us anymore. We thought that maybe, and luckily, we managed to lose them or something on our track. The area, as we said, is pretty heavily wooded and has plenty of slopes, so it's pretty easy to get lost if you're not used to it. Plus, we took an off-trail way that my friend knew. We hid behind a thick bush though, and we decided to try and listen for a bit. There was nothing but silence. No footsteps, no voices. Keep in mind too that even when they were following us, they didn't say a single word. So we took a deep breath and we managed to return to the car eventually, trying our best to be as silent as we could. Upon getting to the car too, we just threw everything in the back, jumped in, and we raced out of there as quickly as we could. But it doesn't end here, because as we left the woods on the main road, we saw coming from a secondary road another car behind us. It was definitely them, and they were following us again. We were positive too that it was the same people because 1, they were basically tailgating us. 2, the area is very rarely visited and there were absolutely 0 cars except for my friend's one, and 3, their car, it had no plates. We drove to my friend's town, avoiding going to his house obviously, taking every country road and every turn that we made. They did as well. As we reached the town square, they made a U-turn though and returned back to the wooded direction that they came from. Obviously though, we were absolutely terrified, and we immediately called the police and informed them as we approached the town square and as they approached us, since me and my friend were basically crying as we got out of the car at this point, to check that area out, but there was no evidence of activity in the following hours. They never did show up again anymore in the following days, but we became really paranoid. For like weeks on end, we refused to leave our houses. And this is exactly why I've taken a break from hiking for about 4 years now. I have no idea who they were or why they acted like they did, but that experience, it definitely left me with a pretty big scar. So this happened yesterday. My brother and I went for a hike to stave off cabin fever from self-isolating. We chose a pretty remote trail to lower the risk of coming into contact with other people. I was walking ahead of my brother, and the gravel on the track was making our footsteps sound pretty loud. Deep in thought, I was listening to the rhythm of his footsteps behind me. About 20 minutes in, I start hearing other footsteps starting off faint and getting louder until they were the same pitch as his, but they were much quicker, like a running rhythm. They suddenly came to a halt, and I could hear the motion of someone stopping on the gravel, that sudden sharp, rocky sound, if you can imagine it. I assumed that there must be somebody running or jogging on the track, and sure enough, I saw a shadow to the side of me appear, which looked like a person's head next to mine, as though they were right behind me. I stopped and turned around to let them pass because the track was narrow, but when I turned around, it was just my brother staring back at me. He was confused as to why I stopped, so I asked if he was running a second ago, and he said no. I asked if there was anyone behind him, and he said that he wasn't aware of anyone. I thought that it was strange, but I just sort of let it go, and I carried on. About 5 minutes later, we come around a corner, and there was this smell that I can only really describe as just pure death, like a really strong off-meat smell. We figured that it must be a dead animal, and we keep going. We eventually reached the Height Lookout, about 20 minutes later, I think, chilled out for a bit, and then we headed back. We passed the death smell, and then around the exact same spot where it had happened before, I started hearing the running sounds again. I ignored it this time because it was starting to freak me out a bit, and just picked up the pace to get back to the car. I told my mum, and she joked that the death smell must have been a dead jogger and I was being haunted by them, to which I laughed at the time, but now, I don't know. I just wonder, what if it was? Maybe I should have investigated the smell. I don't know, but I just wanted to get out of there. So I'll start with a little bit of background detail. I live in the UK and have family in a small town, which is about a 20-minute drive away, I would say, from where I am. The family that live in said town are my dad's first wife and my half-brother and their families. We all get on rather well, and I visit them quite often, in fact. When not in the current self-isolation, that is. But one evening, while driving through in some rather heavy fog, I'm driving along the main road which connects the two towns, a road that I know rather well. I can see the rear of a large dark-coloured van about maybe 100 to 200 feet ahead, with its fog lights illuminated, and all seems fine. There's nothing behind me and nothing ahead of the van. I'm following said van for maybe 3 to 4 miles when we come to a rather heavily wooded section round some rather tight corners, when all of a sudden the fog becomes thicker, which isn't completely unusual along this stretch. But I notice that the van ahead has slowed down, so I bring my speed down to match and continue following the van around the next corner. At this point, the van in front bounces up the curb on the outside of the corner and heads towards a number of trees, and just as the van is about to hit the trees,
it just disappears into the fog and sort of vanishes. This is where it hits me rather quickly as I'm driving along. I have two half-brothers. One is still living, the other one passed away in a road accident between my hometown and the town my family live at, in a van crash about 12 years ago. And I later found out that the spot where the van that I saw going off the road was the exact spot that my half-brother left the road and was killed instantly when his van collided with the tree. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt, which was very much out of the ordinary for him. I can't be sure what happened that night, but I believe that I watched a replay of his final moments on his way home from work that evening. But this story, it has one more twist. So as I was driving along at the brow of the hill a few corners along, I was just on the road and this rather large deer was just stood there in the middle of it. And I don't know, but I just can't help but think that maybe this was all to slow me down and prepare me for this deer that was in the middle of the road so that I wouldn't hit it. But I've driven along the same road many times since, and I've never seen anything out of the ordinary since, even under the same heavy fog conditions. I have a few more stories, but I've been rambling on a little bit too much already, so I'll save them for another time, and I hope you enjoyed this one. Hey guys, so I'm sort of looking for some advice regarding something strange that happened the other night with my girlfriend. So, I've always had a strange feeling that I'm being watched by something in my girlfriend's house. For example, the light will flicker when I'm alone in her bedroom, and has actually blown 3 times while it's just me in the room. No other lights in the house have had any issues. I also frequently suffer from sleep paralysis at her house for some reason, and I've never really had sleep paralysis in my life before this. Now, the other night I was asleep at my house and I was on FaceTime with my girlfriend, who was at her own house. We both accidentally fell asleep while FaceTiming, and I would say at about 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning, I woke up from my sleep, I turned to my phone, and I saw that I was still FaceTiming with my girlfriend, but when I looked at the screen closely, I could see my girlfriend was staring straight back at the camera at me with a sort of blank and slightly angry look on her face, her eyes wide open. I tried to call out to her, but she didn't respond. This went on for maybe 5 minutes. It scared me half to death. During this too, my bedroom was absolutely freezing for some reason. I called out to her again, at which point she slowly turned away from me and faced the wall, still not saying anything. But when she turned away, my bedroom went from completely freezing to warm again, instantly. I couldn't sleep for another hour after she turned away, but when I finally did fall asleep, I woke up and she was in the exact same position as when I fell asleep. In the morning I spoke to her about this, and she had no recollection of what had happened at all. She thought that I was trying to scare her, in fact, and that I made it up. And she then said that she had a nightmare that night, that she got possessed, and she said the dreams happened a few times over the past couple of weeks. I don't know what's going on, though, and I'm just wondering if any of you guys can help or provide some advice. I'm scared to sleep at her house with her because something just doesn't feel right. I have a story from about 2 years ago that really captivates me to this day. When I've told this story to close friends, they tell me it's straight out of a movie, and I really can't disagree with that. So this starts when I finished my first year of college in the Bay Area. I worked my butt off in school, and I just wanted to have a wild summer, and I would do anything that I could to get out of the house. My cousin he's my best friend, and we basically did anything and everything together. When there wasn't anything to do, we would just take walks together around my rural neighborhood. I always lived near this old hospital, which used to operate as the biggest trauma unit in my area. And sometime when I was in high school, they shut the hospital down due to unknown reasons. It basically just sat there rotting for a few years before we found it. And one day my cousin and I were drinking a cold one, taking one of our routine walks, and we just ventured away from our usual route through this peaceful random field. We stumbled across this huge parking lot after making it out of the field, but it didn't hit me right away that this was the old hospital's parking lot that we found. We made our way through the lot until we saw this massively grand building just standing outside of the lot. The deteriorated banner said emergency room, and this is when we knew that we struck gold and stumbled across a back route to this abandoned hospital. We knew of this place, but we'd never been there. We hadn't heard of any weird or outlandish urban legends or anything, nor had anyone that we knew been there before us. So we pushed forward and checked the perimeter. And to our surprise, the first door that we walked up to had a rock jammed in between the door frames so that we could just waltz in. I think this is when we realized that this could potentially be a bad idea if we got caught and we could suffer some consequences. So we agreed that we would be quiet and respectful and we would just make it a quick trip. But this is where things take a turn, or a few turns I should say. So we entered the building, and it was the most deafening quiet that I have ever heard. The sound of the door closing behind us sounded like a literal bombing. And once the echo stopped from the door, it dawned on us too that this place was really creepy. We walk slowly, but the floor is covered in glass, which makes even the smallest steps sound like Bigfoot lumbering around a library. We find a patient room, which still has a bed inside. We stop at the doorway to look inside because the floor looks sketchy. And out of nowhere, from around the corner, we hear the faintest, slow drawn-out whistling. I have never in my life stopped what I was doing so suddenly as well. I just stare wide-eyed at my cousin because even a whisper sounds like yelling in this place. We both have our feet planted to the ground because if we move, those two will make ourselves known. At this point, we both assumed that there could potentially be a squatter or a guard of some sort. My cousin hand gestures to me that we have to leave, and we can't just stand here because the whistling was obviously not going to stop at that point. We turn towards the opposite side of the corner that the whistling is at, and are tiptoeing out to a perfect science almost. And then, the whistling just stops. We freeze. Then we hear the glass crunching from around the corner, and at this, we leg it. Once we get to the door that we came from, we realize that we didn't put a rock in the door frame when we came in, and the door is completely stuck. As we're desperately trying to get this door to open, the glass crunching is now running. We hear the glass crunching until it sounds like it's dangerously close. I'm horrified. We turn around to try another door, and the noise of the glass is literally right in front of us, but there's just nobody there. No one. We book it to another door that says pharmacy and peel open the door. The pharmacy is completely empty except a single perfect placed and aligned landline phone plugged into the wall. The phone is off the hook and is making a dial tone as well, which was weird. The whole thing was perfectly lined up and centered with the whole room, and I've never seen anything like it. The dial tone was so loud in such an empty place that we could actually hear it as well. But the strange thing is that there wasn't any power throughout the hospital, so how the heck was it working? I was in complete shock, so we just ran further and eventually we found a way out. We left and we never went back. After this, I actually heard of some other kids going there at night. I spoke to them as well, and they told me that they heard whistling and thought someone was lurking in the shadows the whole time, just like we did. They never did find the source of the whistling, just like we didn't. But it truly was one of the freakiest experiences that I've ever had.